Did you look at the notes, or are you going in totally blind?
Totally blind. I just clicked into the notes 30 seconds ago,
Oh, great.
and otherwise totally blind.
This idea that the Fed is independent is maybe something that we should revisit. I think it's very reasonable to say that any sitting president should be allowed to remove a Fed governor if he believes it's not aligned with the wishes of the electorate. Could they be a lender of last resort? Personally, in my opinion, no. I think that Treasury does a better job. I think we saw Treasury do that during GFC.
It's really tempting as some guy on the internet to dunk on this, you know? Like, there's so much good material that we could, and he's kind of already just standing under the hoop, like kind of like cowering a little bit and sort of wincing at the anticipation of just being totally dunked on. And it would probably get like a really good view count, and it would be a lot of fun to do. But
that's not what we do here.
That's right. But, I respect Chamath, and that's not what we do here. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to try to elaborate on it. We're going to take some of the ideas, because he played footsie with some really interesting ideas, namely automating the job of the governors. I'm going to show you how that might work. He used the
Taylor
buzzword.
rule.
You beat me to it. Yeah, that's right. But I think
This ain't my first rodeo, Luke.
But I think, yes, okay, we're going to talk about that. But I think even before that, I'm going to show you a little bit how the Taylor root is derived, maybe help some people think about monetary policy in general, as exciting as that sounds.
I mean, I'm really interested to see some of the clips. I don't really know this guy still. I think my only exposure is through, honestly, doing these episodes or some recommendations you've had. But he's all, like, anything that I've seen, he's got such strong Ezra Klein vibes. It's difficult for me to watch sometimes.
Good that you're going in with a nice open mind, Joe.
But the bigger issue, I think, is asking from first principles, what does the Fed actually do in 2025? So we have an extremely vibrant and complicated and interconnected $130 trillion global economy. It's moving at the speed of light. The Fed gets together once a month, tries to divine what monetary policy, what the money supply should look like, based on data that is often incorrect. We see that in the BLS data. We see that in the GDP prints. We see it in all of the inputs. And so we've turned over responsibility to a handful of humans using bad inputs. Do they actually create monetary policy and price stability? I would say that the capital markets and the free markets actually do a better job of that. They define much more what the spread is. I think SOFR is a much better rate mechanism than the Fed funds rate at this point. And so I would actually question whether that responsibility should sit with a handful of humans looking at faulty month-old data. So, for example, today, the Commerce Department did something that was pretty exceptional. They said, we're going to start publishing data to the blockchain. All the GDP data is now going into a blockchain. So can you imagine what this starts? I think, and we've talked about this before, I think employment data from all these employment companies and payroll companies should get published this way. GDP data can get published this way. All kinds of economic measures scrubbed for anonymity should get published so that you can have pricing oracles that actually tell you what's happening in real time. And the markets will then react and set rates in real time.
Not bad. I was not as turned off as I thought I might be. His central thesis is free markets. What's his background? He's I don't know, like a VC guy or something. He feels very, very confident in his ability to identify things, i.e. the market. So I get that. That's pretty classic, random walk stuff. I'm not sure if it's deciding monetary policy or implementation of monetary policy. So if you take away deciding monetary policy, you don't need the implementation side either.
Those are two very different things. And there is no way that SOFR would like set that rate. Like, if you had SOFR, if it was going free market, then no one would set the rate. You would just abandon that. So the idea that he kind of flipped to it okay, well, we're going to publish all this data up front, and then the market would decide. It means that no organization is going to decide.
Which doesn't work in our current structure of very carefully propped up and monitored and implemented system that goes through the Fed, through their markets group. But I guess if you take everything away, you don't really need it anymore. I think you can dream up a lot of scenarios where that's going to go wrong at the exact moments when you don't need them to. Basically, just any kind of panic in the world, financial panic, geopolitical panic, anything. And people panic all the time.
So we might be able to find some place in between. Like maybe not get rid of the Fed altogether. One thing he was really railing against had to do with how the Fed had become political, right? So now it's not really deciding. The humans should not be involved. And he was, I guess, taking a nod towards the free market. Like all the humans collectively should decide. But maybe instead we can put it and automate it with a formula. If we want to just zoom in on exactly inflation, like that whole question, one of the roles of the Fed obviously is price stability. So let's just start with the question of like, what is a price? Joe, what is a price?
Well, you've got it spelled out pretty nicely, yeah, on screen here.
Yeah,
but
it's just like money per good. That's a price. Now, what if we decided to take that and we were like, you know what? We want the entire economy. Oh, so we want like all money over all goods is just some average price, right? Now let's add in another dimension here. Let's add in time. Now all of a sudden you have sort of the delta in money and credit, I'm saying, divided by all goods. Now all goods produced, that's really GDP. And then the change in the average price, so that's what inflation is. Nothing too exciting here. And what the Fed is trying to do, it's just kind of to solve for that numerator over there. It's like, what should that money and credit number be? Given stuff that's changing in the denominator, GDP growth, which it has some control over, but mostly it's a GDP taker, how much stuff is produced. And then inflation is the target they're trying to hit. Now we can kind of look at this and we can start playing around with different shocks. So like the COVID shock is a pretty clear example. So in that case, there was a supply shock. So the denominator went down, right? And so what is that going to do to prices? Well, that's going to put upward pressure on prices because we know how ratios work. Now, on the second half of that is not only did the supply, the number of goods that were produced go down, but also we put in a whole lot of stimulus, right? So we also pushed upward pressure in the numerator, and then we got two things pushing up inflation, and then sure enough, that's what we saw. At one point in time, the amount of money that was circulating out there was relatively fixed. Now, the way you can measure for the demand for money is just the interest rate. And like an interest rate is essentially just the cost of bringing money from the future into the present. Now, we can measure in that sense the quote unquote tightness of money by the interest rate at the time. And we can look at a period in which a supply shock happened, in which there was like an increase in goods, and then you can see what happens to the demand for money at that time. So this is cool. This is a paper from 1910. So it is a publication of the National Monetary Commission. I mentioned the last episode that I hosted that there was a period between the panic of 2007 and then when the Federal Reserve was actually set up in like 1913, in which they were studying kind of how to do monetary policy. Now, a lot of that studying was done through the National Monetary Commission right here. And this is like one of 30 papers or something that they wrote. And it's called The Seasonal Variations in the Relative Demand for Money and Capital in the United States. Are you familiar with this?
I'm not.
All right. So this is one of the graphs. These are cool. This is hand drawn. This is from like 1910. Wow. And what it is, it's the seasonal variations in the relative demand for money and capital is evidenced by interest rates. They're looking at call loans. And the one you're interested in, they both sort of say the same thing. The index number is the solid black line below that. They used a method to kind of, better average things out over the year. But you can look at A or B, it tells the same story. Now, interest rates over there, that's on the right side. You can see they sort of peaked in like 7% or so around October. So that's sort of indicating when the demand for money is tighter. People want more money. Now, according to the formula that we were just looking at, which you would expect that if there was a big supply shock, so a big increase in supply, that the demand for money increased, that would put a shock through to interest rates, like here. What do you think that supply shock was? Coming in around, looks like October.
October. Does it say what year this is? Oh,
So this is an average
wait a
over
minute. This is a 18-year period. I don't have a great answer.
It's the harvest. So this was something that was known at the time. Like they knew every time come October, come the fall, they knew that there was suddenly an influx of goods, a big increase of goods into the market. And that just naturally raised the demand for money. What are you looking at?
Sorry, I was squinting in at the x-axis there. Which increase are you talking? So like this dark black line, right?
It's this
like about
spike.
halfway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say harvest, though, isn't that referring to some sort of seasonal component? Isn't this showing like an 18-year period?
This graph is the like average interest rate by week in the year.
Oh, got it.
Over
these
18 years.
All right.
Sorry, that wasn't
I'm with
clear.
you now.
Yeah. Okay, and it would spike in October. Here's another graph, sort of taking similar data, but it was used for something slightly different. And what they're looking at is the variation in interest rates. And this is in Boston. And they have different graphs from this paper, which we're going to include a link to in the show notes. But New York looked similar to this. Basically, things get kind of wonky come the fall. It was generally understood that the demand for money would spike around the harvest time. I would just end by adding that it is not an accident that the panic of 1907 happened in October. It's not, the harvest was not the cause of the panic, but it did sort of set the scene. It made liquidity was already generally tight. So it was just kind of more risky. So now kind of with those concepts at hand, I'm going to show you something real quick, okay? Just real quick, Joe. You still with us? Was that too bad?
I saw that R star. That's the thing that somehow caught my eye first.
Yeah. So, I mean, you called it out earlier. This is the Taylor rule. And people kind of point to this and say, look, this thing right here could automate the Fed. This is what's going to figure out what the interest rate should be. So let's just put some names to this stuff. So we have the nominal interest rate. That's the thing that the Fed actually sets every 6 weeks. We have this R star number, the equilibrium real interest rate. Okay. That's typically viewed to be 2%, although no one really knows what it is. We have current inflation. That's pi. Don't ask me why they label it pi. But that's the current kind of running inflation. Over here, we have the target inflation. So that's 2%. We have GDP growth, right? So now we're starting to kind of weave in sort of the concepts that we talked about earlier. And then what's referred to as potential GDP, which again is kind of a number that no one really knows exactly what it is at any one time, but it's kind of expected to also be around 2%. And then you put some weights. So this is usually 0.5. Again, no one's totally sure, but 0.5 is typically used. Now let's just kind of put in some numbers and kind of show you how this might work. But again, 2%, that's sort of R star roughly. Current inflation recently is around 3%. A target inflation is 2%. Our GDP print recently was 3%. It's pretty strong. And our potential GDP, again, 2%. That gives you according to this Taylor rule, the interest rate set should be 6%.
You're above inflation. You're above your potential growth. Checks out.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So if you wanted to break this down even further, you would say, look, if this is over here, if this is a positive number, that would mean that current inflation is higher than target inflation. So you should expect to see a higher nominal growth rate. Likewise, if you're running quote unquote hot in GDP, you're going to want to try to cool the economy by raising interest rates.
Yeah, I mean, just back to your original thing there, that's that kind of good side. If you're running hot, you're producing more goods than you thought you would, bring that back into balance.
Although kind of what I was saying was like if GDP is, from that other thing with the price, what I was saying and what that other kind of formula would suggest would be, okay, well, if GDP is going really high, then you want to increase the money supply, right? Now that would be stimulatory. Whereas what this Taylor rule thing does is it kind of tamps it down. So that's kind of interesting because then in that other sense, and what we saw earlier was like if GDP goes up and then demand for money and credit also goes up, interest rates go up, it's almost like naturally stabilizing. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So like in that other example that we were looking at with just like money, the money supply divided by all the goods, if we had like the same shock that came around with the harvest, a whole bunch of goods entered into the market, then interest rates would rise. It would almost kind of self-correct. All right. Now let's take a look at how did this thing actually do? The St. Louis Fed, which is where the FRED sits the economic data, they track this. And they sort of compare it to where the actual Fed funds rate effective rate is. So that's the one in red. So that's what the actual is. And then the blue is what the formula would imply it should be. Right? Now let's take a look at this past record. More recently, remember back here, when inflation started to take off, the Taylor rule was saying stuff like, put it up at 12% at its peak. I don't know about you, but this actually looks pretty good. I mean, whereas before, if we're saying that Jerome Powell was too late and that all these, what we were saying down here was like, it's transitory, don't worry about it. Maybe it would have made sense to jack up the interest rate a lot earlier, right? The other thing that the Taylor rule would have done, it would have kept it a lot higher in this area, right? It wouldn't have just kept it at zero for all that time. It would have started hiking earlier in before the 2008 crisis. So maybe that would have made it a little bit less severe because it would have kind of slowed it or eased it. I mean, I don't know about you, but the Taylor rule looks pretty good. And obviously the thing is, you also have to remember is like, this is what it looked like at any one time. So if they, wanted to, if per the Taylor rule, they started to increase it right here, there's no reason that inflation wouldn't have gotten as bad as it was, bad as it had eventually gotten to warrant a Taylor rule of 12%, right? So presumably all of this would have evened it out. You would have never even had to get anywhere near this high.
Yeah, I mean, looks pretty good. The contours of both follow the same thing, but that's probably more so a function of incoming economic data that both are taking.
Right. So that's the other thing. Now, one of the biggest problems with the Taylor rule has to do with the fact that getting data for this is extremely difficult. Economic data in general is extremely difficult. I think it is an extremely hampered science study, if you like, because just the data is so garbage. It's like we are sort of in the era today, I think, in economics, the way like microbiologists were like 200 years ago, before the invention of the microscope. We just don't have a view into this stuff. We don't have nearly as good granular data. And this is sort of getting onto Chamath's last point when he mentioned about GDP data being published to the blockchain.
So, for example, today, the Commerce Department did something that was pretty exceptional. They said, we're going to start publishing data to the blockchain. All the GDP data is now going into a blockchain.
And people were like, oh, what, like all of it altogether? All he meant was a PDF. He just meant like a PDF was shared on the blockchain, the same one that, we cover here every month or so. But then he elaborated further, would be like, well, what if, right now, imagine Bloomberg or something in which there is a real time, you can see the real time prices change like instantly, right? And you can see the quantity that's being done, All of it is extremely transparent. It's all there. Now imagine if you had something like that, except with all the goods in the economy. Like all of it was, we were using some sort of, I don't know, crypto, stablecoin, whatever it is. It's on a blockchain. You can actually track it. And you could see like what the last price was paid for like such and such pair of jeans, or like all the pairs of jeans. What if you could do that with all the eggs, all the food, all the energy, everything that was bought? And you can tally up all of these transactions so you would immediately see what the GDP was at any given time, right? I mean, just if you look on that, like as an economist, the the field, the entire economics field, would have just just a huge explosion of discoveries. I guess I'll just finish by saying, to that point, I think that in the future, when we look back on this era, to Chamath's point of like 12 people getting in a room every 6 weeks, it's a big boardroom with big heavy oak tables, and they're all talking about the economy using this like pieces of paper and data and just like single numbers that they could look at, as extremely archaic and backwards. At some point in the future, they're going to look at that and say it was crazy that that's how we set monetary policy, as opposed to something like this, like using an equation or something, and you just got real-time data all the time.
Yeah, I take your point, but everything you just described really only solves for one variable in this big complicated thing, though.
Well,
I
no,
guess you
it
could
would
back
be
out inflation, but
you'd get inflation, and you'd get GDP. You'd get these two. I think Pi Star is kind of set. I think what I meant by like the econ study, like the whole, or not the econ study, what the econ field would benefit from, I think you would actually start to get a better idea of R star. R star is just like this like theoretical thing. Like it moves around too. It's not fixed. Y star too, like GDP potential. These are functions of things much greater than just economics. It's like demographics and productivity and technology and all sorts of other stuff. You can just kind of have to guess at it.
I think that's the core issue with this, in that these are made up terms. This potential GDP and natural rate of interest. Even if you had this much more perfect real time price transparency and activity transparency, would that really tell you about what the potential should be from there? R star, by definition, is completely unobservable. Potential GDP growth, completely unobservable. And it's like, at that point, it's like what should the economy be growing at? It's like, should we be growing as fast as we are? Should we, in America, let's say, should we all be working harder? People are the busiest in the US because we've got this culture of work, 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 work. And are you always just going to be choosing higher and higher potential GDP growths? Or, I mean, I think you can make an argument for someone saying it's like, oh, well, no, we should be targeting a lower potential GDP at this point. I absolutely agree. It would it would be incredible to know with like such detail what the the first Y term is, what the real GDP is. But I think fundamentally, those forward-looking components, what the natural rate of interest is, and what the potential GDP growth is, I just don't think that's the human component that needs to steer this equation. This is, to me, that's the main piece that holds back automating the Fed, or at least the choosing interest rates.
Yeah, okay. I hear that. What I envisioned a little bit for this would also be that there's no reason that you'd have to set the interest rate, or the interest rate would change every 6 weeks. It could be instant. And I think if you were able to kind of tweak like that, I think you'd be able to tease out R star and Y star over time. You could at least start to really ask the question around it.
Pre-COVID, it was generally pretty understood. I think John Williams, he's president of the New York Fed. Basically, his whole academic career focused around R star. He just talks about it continuously still. The estimate was like 2.5% area. And, maybe I'm behind on some of his latest updates, but I think everyone agrees today it's probably not the same, but there doesn't seem to be agreed upon how much higher should it be today. It really just all goes back to, at some level, you're playing a guessing game. And that's exactly what we're doing today. And I guess I just feel unconvinced that we wouldn't be playing that same guessing game in some way in the future with, like you said, this perfect information about prices and activity.
Okay, sure. At some level, yes, you would have to. I'm not saying that all assumptions would be out the door. I guess that would imply perfect. That would make us gods.
So that's like my starting point, though. If you're saying, get rid of the rate setting committee, that's effectively what we're trying to, for lack of a better word, solve for here, right?
Yeah. And you're saying don't do that? I guess what you would do, I guess kind of to what your point is like, set a number. Humans would maybe revisit the R star and Y star number every year or something. Do a study on it and maybe adjust that. And that would be the big announcement. And then kind of let the Taylor rule go.
And then, for sure. But, just to poke some more holes, functionally, how would that be different than having a rate setting committee?
Well, I don't think they wouldn't set the rates. They would certainly influence it, but they wouldn't meet every. Yeah, no, I think it would be totally different. They would only meet once a year.
Or something like that. The year's arbitrary.
And they wouldn't actually set the rates. The Taylor rule would do it instantaneously. It would change like every week or something.
Actually, I'm actually starting to come around to this for that reason. In a way, I would think of what you just described as the rate setting committee with way better information. My point is that there's fundamentally the human component there. And so if you aim to automate everything away, you can, but you I don't want to get philosophical here, but you might lose your humanity along the way. It's like, I don't care what GDP, like, I don't care how I feel or how the population feels. GDP growth needs to get to this number.
I guess I really didn't think of Y star like that at all. That would just be kind of the natural GDP growth, whatever the hell that means.
And like, I guess my point is that those are two freely floating, unobservable numbers simultaneously. If there was only one of those in there, I'd be far more convinced. And like, this looks like a great system.
Yeah, the other thing is like maybe the Taylor rule is wrong. I mean, maybe you shouldn't have R star in there at all, or like Y star in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but
and
anyway,
it just looks really good so far over the past.
It looks pretty good,
60 years.
Hey, Joe. Well, that's all I had for you today. Thanks for listening to the Root of All Evil podcast. My name is Luke.
My name's Joe.
We will see you next week.